Little boy pointed gun at bikers and said, "Step forward if you are my father." What the bikers did next left everyone speechless. The thunder and the drunken singing cut off instantly as the front door crashed open, slamming against the wall. The wind howled through the opening, bringing the sharp smell of rain and a small, drenched figure. The boy couldn't have been more than 8 or 9. His clothes hung heavy on his thin frame. Water dripped from his dark hair, pooling at his feet. But it was what he held in his trembling hands that caused every single person in the bar to freeze mid-motion. The revolver looked ancient and far too big for his small grip, yet he held it with desperate, fierce determination, pointing it generally at the crowd of Iron Saints. "Step forward if you're my father." His voice cracked, a mixture of raw fear and fierce resolve, making the words waver in the sudden, deafening silence. The jukebox, as if sensing the gravity of the moment, cut off mid-chorus. A flash of lightning illuminated him from behind, and in that brief, stark moment, everyone saw the tears cutting clean tracks through the dirt on his face. His lower lip trembled, but his grip on the gun remained firm, even as his whole body shook with cold and emotion. The bikers sat motionless, their expressions shifting from shock to a complicated recognition of deep pain. Behind the bar, Maggie's hand pressed against her heart. Thunder rolled directly overhead. The boy's chest heaved with each breath, his eyes darting frantically from face to face, searching for a face, a moment of recognition. In the stunned, dangerous crowd before him, the standoff had begun. The bar fell into a deep silence, broken only by the steady drumming of rain against the windows. Every breath held, every muscle tensed. The boy's small hands trembled around the rusty revolver, his knuckles white with strain. Bear Dalton's weathered face remained calm as he slowly pushed his chair back. The wooden legs scraped against the floor, making everyone flinch. At 6'4", his broad shoulders and leather-clad frame usually commanded attention, but now he moved with the gentle care of someone approaching a wounded animal. "Bear!" "Don't," whispered Tommy, one of his fellow Iron Saints, grabbing his arm. "That gun might be loaded." Bear shook his head slightly, easing his arm free. His boots made soft thuds against the wooden floor as he took measured steps toward the boy. The child's eyes grew wider with each step, but the gun remained pointed straight ahead. Rain dripped from the boy's dark hair onto his thin t-shirt, creating small puddles around his mud-caked sneakers. He couldn't have been more than 8 or 9 years old, Bear thought, and his heart ached at the desperation in those young eyes. "Hey there, little man," Bear said softly, lowering himself to one knee about 6 feet away. His voice, usually gruff from years of rough living, came out gentle as a summer breeze. "That's a mighty big thing you're holding." The boy's lower lip quivered. "Don't come closer," he warned, but his voice cracked on the last word. "All right. I'll stay right here," Bear assured him, raising his open palms. "But you're shaking pretty bad there. Must be cold from all that rain." A flash of lightning illuminated the bar through the windows, followed by a low rumble of thunder. The boy jumped slightly, but kept the gun raised. My mama," the boy started, his voice barely above a whisper. "Before she said my daddy wore that patch." His eyes flickered to the Iron Saint's patch on Bear's leather vest. Bear glanced down at his patch, the same one all his brothers wore. The symbol of their brotherhood, their family. When he looked back up, he saw tears mixing with raindrops on the boy's cheeks. "That must have been real hard for you," Bear said, his voice thick with understanding. "Coming in here all by yourself, being this brave." The boy's arm wavered, the boy's arm, gun lowering slightly. I just want." "I know, son," Bear said, inching forward on his knee. "I know exactly what you want." He opened his arms wide, his scarred hands extended in welcome rather than threat. "And nobody here's gonna hurt you. You can let go now." Something in the boy's face crumbled. The gun slipped from his fingers, hitting the floor with a hollow clang that echoed through the silent bar. His small body seemed to fold in on itself as he stumbled forward. Bear caught him as he fell, wrapping strong arms around the boy's shaking frame. The child buried his face in Bear's leather vest and began to sob. Deep, heart-wrenching cries that spoke of more pain than any child should carry. Thunder rolled outside, but inside Maggie's roadhouse not a single person moved. They all watched in stunned silence as their leader, one of the toughest men any of them knew, held this lost boy like he was made of glass, one large hand cradling the back of his head while the other rubbed soothing circles on his back. The storm outside grew fiercer as Bear guided the small boy toward a corner booth. The child's wet clothes left dark patches on the worn leather seats. His shoulders trembled, whether from cold or fear. Bear couldn't tell. Probably both. "Maggie," Bear called out, his gravelly voice gentle. "Can we get some hot cocoa for the kid?" Maggie Turner hustled behind the bar, her silver hair catching the dim light. Her weathered hands moved with practiced ease, preparing the drink. The boy watched her every movement, his eyes wide and wary. "I should call Tom," Maggie said quietly, reaching for the phone on the wall. "Sheriff needs to know about this." "No!" The boy's voice cracked with panic. His small hands gripped the edge of the table. "Please, no cops. They'll send me back to foster care. I can't go back there." Bear raised his hand, stopping Maggie. The other bikers had gathered nearby, forming a protective circle around the booth. Their leather vests creaked as they shifted uncomfortably, exchanging concerned glances. "All right, son," Bear said, sliding into the seat across from the boy. "No cops for now, but you need to tell us what's going on." "I'm Bear. These are my brothers from the Iron Saints." Maggie arrived with the hot cocoa, topped with mini marshmallows. She set it down carefully in front of the boy, who wrapped his small fingers around the warm mug. "I'm Eli," he said quietly, staring into the steaming drink. "My mom." His voice wavered, and he took a shaky breath. "She died last week. Cancer." A heavy silence fell over the bar. Maggie's hand went to her heart, and several of the bikers removed their caps. "Before she—" Eli struggled with the words. "Before she went, she told me about my dad. Said he used to come to this bar years ago. Said he wore that patch." He pointed at the Iron Saints emblem on Bear's vest. The bikers exchanged worried looks. 8 years ago, dozens of members had passed through these parts. Some were still around, others long gone, and a few were no longer riding at all. "She never told me his name," Eli continued, his voice barely above a whisper. "Just said I might find him here. I've been watching the bar for 3 days, waiting for bikers to show up." He looked down at his hands. "I took the gun from my uncle's drawer. I'm sorry. I was scared." Bear leaned forward, his weathered face softening. "It's okay, kid. We'll figure this out together." His eyes caught something glinting on the boy's wrist, a silver bracelet that had slipped out from under his sleeve. The world seemed to slow down as Bear stared at the engraving. 2 simple letters that made his heart stop. E.D. He recognized those initials. He'd seen them before. Years ago, on a similar bracelet he'd given to someone special, someone he'd left behind. His hands, steady through countless storms and battles, began to shake ever so slightly. The hot cocoa sat untouched, steam rising in the heavy air as thunder rolled outside. Bear couldn't tear his eyes away from those 2 letters that threatened to unravel everything he thought he knew. The rain drummed a gentler rhythm now on Maggie's metal roof. Bear Dalton sat at the worn oak bar, his calloused fingers wrapped around a coffee mug gone cold. Every few seconds, his eyes drifted to the booth, where Eli lay curled up under someone's leather jacket, his small chest rising and falling in peaceful sleep. The boy's face was softer now, peaceful in a way that made Bear's heart ache. Someone had cleaned the dirt off his cheeks, and Maggie had managed to towel dry his hair. He looked so small, so vulnerable. Nothing like the fierce little warrior who'd burst through those doors an hour ago. Bear's gaze fixed on the silver bracelet glinting on Eli's wrist. Those initials, E.D., kept pulling at something deep in his memory, like an old wound that never quite healed right. Annie, he whispered, the name feeling both foreign and familiar on his tongue. His mind drifted back to that summer, 20-some years ago. She'd worked right here at Maggie's, serving beers with a smile that could light up the darkest corner of the bar. Her blonde hair always caught the sunset just right through these same windows, making it look like she wore a halo. They'd fallen hard and fast, the way young people do. Bear remembered their first date. A midnight ride under stars so bright they seemed close enough to touch. Annie had wrapped her arms around his waist, pressed her cheek against his back, and trusted him completely. "You'll come back," she'd said the morning he left for his third tour. Not a question, but a statement of faith. She'd slipped a letter into his pocket, made him promise not to read it until he reached his base. But Bear never did read that letter. He'd lost it somewhere between here and Baghdad, along with pieces of himself he couldn't name. When he finally made it back stateside, he was different. Harder, colder. The thought of facing Annie's pure heart with his damaged one had been unbearable, so he'd stayed away, rode further and further out, taking increasingly dangerous jobs, as if testing whether he deserved to survive at all. Her letters found him anyway, 3 of them, the last one he'd sent back unopened. Bear's hands shook as he set down his mug. The math was there, staring him in the face. The timing, those initials, Eli's age, the way the boy's eyes had flashed with that same fierce determination he'd seen in Annie's that last morning. "Dalton," he murmured, working it out. Eli Dalton. A car passed outside, its headlights sweeping across the bar's interior. The brief illumination caught Eli's face, and for a moment, Bear saw Annie's features mapped perfectly onto the boy's, the slight upturn of his nose, the stubborn set of his jaw even in sleep. In the booth, Eli shifted, mumbling something in his dreams. The leather jacket slipped, and Bear noticed the boy's T-shirt was worn thin at the shoulders. His sneakers, peeking out from under the table, were held together with duct tape. The sight hit Bear like a physical blow. He'd walked away from Annie, thinking he was protecting her from his darkness. Instead, he might have left her to raise their son alone. And now, Bear's throat tightened as he looked at the sleeping child. "It can't be," he whispered, the words barely audible over the gentle patter of rain. Morning sunlight streamed through Maggie's roadhouse's dusty windows, casting long shadows across the worn wooden floor. The storm had passed, leaving behind puddles that sparkled in the dawn light. Inside, members of the Iron Saints gathered around the bar, their leather vests creaking as they shifted uncomfortably, speaking in hushed tones. Eli stirred in the booth where he'd spent the night, wrapped in Maggie's old quilted blanket. His eyes flew open, wild with panic at the unfamiliar surroundings. His small body tensed, ready to bolt. Bear noticed immediately and moved toward him with careful steps. "Easy there, kid," he said, his gravelly voice gentle. "You're safe here." The boy's shoulders relaxed slightly, but his eyes darted between the faces around him. I'm sorry about the gun," he whispered. We all do things we shouldn't when we're scared, Bear said, settling into the booth across from him. Maggie appeared with a plate of scrambled eggs and toast, setting it down with a motherly smile. Eat up, sweetheart, she said. You look like you haven't had a proper meal in days. The other bikers pulled chairs closer, forming a protective circle around the booth. Chuck, the club's secretary, pulled out a weathered ledger. We keep records of every member who's ever worn our patch, he explained, going back 30 years. And I've got boxes of old photographs in the storage room, Maggie added, from all the gatherings here over the years. Bear watched Eli pick at his eggs. Listen, boy, he said, leaning forward. We're going to help you find your father. The Iron Saints take care of their own, and right now, that includes you. Tears welled up in Eli's eyes. Really? Really? Bear confirmed, his heart twisting at the hope in the child's voice. Maggie touched Eli's shoulder. I've got a small room in the back, she said. Used to be my son's. It's yours for as long as you need it. The bikers spread out across the bar, some diving into old photo albums, others calling contacts who might remember Annie Monroe. Bear watched them work, his own memories of Annie burning in his chest like hot coal. Eli clutched a photograph Maggie had found. A young woman with kind eyes and a gentle smile, wearing a blue dress and standing in front of the bar. That's my mama, he said softly. She used to say this was her favorite place. Bear remembered that dress, that smile. Annie Monroe had worn it the last time he'd seen her, before shipping out. The memory hit him, like a physical blow. The morning wore on, and eventually Eli's exhaustion caught up with him. Maggie led him to the back room, which she'd quickly prepared with fresh sheets and a nightlight. The boy crawled into bed, still holding his mother's photograph close to his chest. From the doorway, Bear watched Eli's breathing slow into sleep, the weight of guilt pressed down on his shoulders, heavy as iron. He thought of Annie's last letter, still unopened after all these years, tucked away in his old footlocker. He thought of promises unkept and roads not taken. Maggie appeared beside him, her voice barely a whisper. That boy's been through enough. Bear, whatever comes next, he needs people he can count on. Bear nodded, unable to tear his eyes away from Eli's sleeping form. The morning light caught the silver in his beard as he stood guard, a sentinel at the threshold of redemption. The morning sun cast long shadows through Maggie's roadhouse's dusty windows. Around a weathered oak table, 6 leather-clad bikers hunched over a faded map, their coffee cups leaving rings on its worn surface. Bear stood at the head, his calloused finger tracing routes between towns. Annie worked here about 8 years ago, Maggie said, setting down a fresh pot of coffee. Lot of riders came through back then. She glanced toward the kitchen where Eli was arranging bacon on a paper towel, his small face scrunched in concentration. We'll start with the chapters down south, Bear decided, his voice gravelly from lack of sleep. Mike, reach out to the Desert Hawks. The bikers nodded, pulling out cell phones and old address books. The air filled with muttered conversations and the scratch of pencils on paper. Names were written down, crossed off, circled, and questioned. In the kitchen, Eli stood on a stepping stool beside Maggie, carefully cracking eggs into a bowl. Like this? He asked, fishing out a tiny piece of shell. Perfect. Sugar! Maggie smiled, ruffling his hair. You've got steady hands. The sound of their laughter drifted into the main room, making several of the tough bikers smile despite themselves. One of them, an older man named Doc, wiped his glasses and squinted at a list of names. Remember that group that rode through in spring? He asked. The Night Wolves? Add them to the list? Bear nodded, but his mind wandered to the boy in the kitchen. There was something in the way Eli tilted his head when he concentrated. just like, "Order up!" Eli's proud voice cut through his thoughts. The boy carried a plate stacked with slightly crooked toast, Maggie following with eggs and bacon. The bikers cleared space among their papers, their serious faces softening at the sight of Eli's earnest expression. "Well, look who's turned into a regular short-order cook," Tommy grinned, accepting a plate. "Maggie showed me how to make the toast not too dark," Eli explained, climbing onto a chair. His feet didn't reach the floor, but he sat tall, like he belonged there. The mood lightened as they ate. Mike told a silly joke that made Eli giggle, and Doc taught him a simple card trick. For a moment, it felt almost normal, just a family breakfast on a sunny morning. But as Bear reached for his wallet to give Maggie some cash for supplies, something slipped out and fluttered to the floor. His heart stopped when he saw what it was. A photograph, creased and worn at the edges. He thought he'd thrown away all the old pictures, but this one had survived. Tucked in a forgotten compartment, in it, a younger version of himself stood next to a beautiful woman with kind eyes and a gentle smile, Annie. They were leaning against his bike, her head on his shoulder, both laughing at something long forgotten. Bear's hands trembled as he picked up the photo. The woman in the picture had Eli's same delicate nose, the same way of smiling with her whole face. How had he not seen it before? From the kitchen came another burst of laughter. Eli was showing Maggie how to make a smiley face with bacon on the griddle. The sound twisted in Bear's chest like a knife. He carefully tucked the photo back into his wallet, his weathered face tight with emotion. The truth he'd been avoiding settled over him like a heavy blanket, impossible to ignore any longer. The morning sun warmed the chrome of the motorcycles parked outside Jenny's diner. Inside, the smell of bacon and coffee filled the air as Eli sat squeezed between Bear and Chuck, another Iron Saint, in a red vinyl booth. The boy's feet dangled above the checkered floor, not quite reaching the ground. Bear said, pointing to the menu with its colorful pictures of pancakes and waffles. Eli's eyes widened at the choices. He hadn't seen this much food in days. Can I have chocolate chip pancakes?" "You sure can." Bear nodded, his gruff voice gentler than usual. "How about we add some whipped cream on top?" The waitress, Jenny herself, brought over their orders. She set a towering stack of pancakes drowned in syrup and whipped cream in front of Eli. For the first time since he'd walked into Maggie's that rainy night, a real smile spread across his face. "Look at that smile!" Chuck grinned, elbowing Bear. "Kid's got good taste in breakfast." The other bikers crowded around nearby tables, their leather vests and tattoos drawing curious looks from other customers. But nobody minded, not with Eli's infectious happiness lighting up the whole place. After breakfast, they gathered in the empty parking lot behind the diner. Bear's Harley gleamed in the sunlight, its engine quiet for now. "Want to learn something cool?" Bear asked, steadying his bike. Eli nodded eagerly. "First rule of motorcycles. Respect the machine," Bear explained, helping Eli onto the seat. The boy's hands gripped the handlebars tight, his knuckles white with concentration. "Easy there, champion," Bear chuckled, keeping one hand on Eli's back. "Just feel how it balances. That's it." The other bikers gathered around, calling out encouragement. Chuck couldn't help himself. "Hey, look at Papa Bear teaching his cub." Bear shot him a look, but there was no real anger in it. Something about the nickname felt right, even if he wasn't ready to admit it. "Now lean a little to the left," Bear instructed, supporting Eli's weight. "See how it wants to stay upright? That's called gyroscopic effect. It's like magic," Eli whispered, his fear melting into wonder. They spent the afternoon there, Bear teaching Eli about engines and balance, the other bikers chiming in with their own tips and stories. Time seemed to slow down, marked only by Eli's growing confidence and the lengthening shadows. As the sun began to set, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink, Bear helped Eli off the motorcycle. Time to head back to Maggie's, kid. Without thinking about it, Bear held out his Ondersol, and Eli took it, his small fingers wrapping around Bear's calloused palm. They walked together down the quiet street, their shadows stretching long behind them. Bear felt something shift inside his chest, a warmth he hadn't experienced in years. The simple act of holding this boy's hand, protecting him, guiding him, it awakened something he thought he'd lost long ago. Eli squeezed his hand once, looking up at Bear with trust in his eyes. The tough biker had to swallow hard past the lump in his throat. They didn't speak. They didn't need to. Sometimes the smallest gestures say more than words ever could. The old clock on the bar wall ticked past midnight. Everyone else had gone home, leaving Bear alone with his thoughts and a worn envelope. He sat at his usual spot at the bar, a glass of untouched whiskey beside him. The letter trembled in his weathered hands as he unfolded it carefully, treating the paper like it might crumble to dust. Annie's elegant handwriting flowed across the yellowed page. Bear's throat tightened as he read the words he'd been too afraid to face 20 years ago. "My dearest Bear," the letter began, "I know you're far away, fighting battles I can't imagine. But I have news that might bring light to your darkest days. I'm carrying your child." Bear's fingers traced the words, feeling the slight indentations where her pen had pressed into the paper. He remembered her smile, the way her eyes crinkled at the corners when she laughed. The letter continued, each word driving deeper into his heart. "I hope this baby will have your strength, your kind heart hidden beneath that tough exterior. I dream of the day you'll come home to us. This love we created deserves a chance. Bear, it deserves you." He took a shaky breath, glancing toward the back room where Eli slept. The boy had Annie's gentle features. How had he not seen it before? The way he tilted his head when thinking, just like she used to do. The quiet determination in his eyes. "I know you're scared of settling down," the letter went on. "The road always calls you. But this baby might give you a reason to stay, to build something real. I'll wait for you, Bear. We both will." A tear splashed onto the paper. Bear quickly wiped it away, careful not to smudge the ink. He'd never received this letter. It had stayed tucked away in Annie's keepsake box, waiting all these years. While he rode free on the highways, his son grew up without him. The weight of 2 decades of absence pressed down on his shoulders. He stood up, his legs unsteady, and walked to the window. The moon cast long shadows across the bar's wooden floor. Through the partially open door to the back room, he could see Eli's small form curled up under a blanket Maggie had given him. Bear pressed his forehead against the cool glass. "Lord," he whispered, his voice rough with emotion, "what if I left my own blood behind?" The question hung in the air, heavy with regret and possibility. The boy shifted in his sleep, clutching his pillow tighter. Bear watched him, seeing now what he should have recognized from the start, the shadow of himself in a child who'd grown up fatherless. He folded the letter carefully, sliding it back into its envelope. The truth sat like a stone in his chest, too heavy to share just yet. He needed to be certain before he said anything to the others, before he told Eli. Thunder rumbled in the distance, another storm rolling in. Bear remained at the window, a silent guardian, watching over the son he never knew he had. The words from Annie's letter echoed in his mind, a ghost of hope from the past, now haunting his present. Morning light streamed through the windows of Bear's old pickup truck as it rumbled down Main Street. The leather seats creaked with every bump, and Eli bounced in the middle seat between Bear and Maggie, his small hands gripping the worn fabric beneath him. "Are we going to see a doctor?" Eli asked, his voice tinged with worry. His eyes darted between Bear and the approaching clinic building. Bear's weathered hands tightened on the steering wheel. "Sort of, kid. Just some quick tests. Nothing to worry about." Maggie reached over and squeezed Eli's shoulder. "It'll be over before you know it, sugar. And after, we can stop for ice cream at Miller's." Her smile was warm, but her eyes held concern as she watched Bear's face. The truck pulled into the clinic's nearly empty parking lot. Bear killed the engine but didn't move. His fingers drummed against the wheel, a nervous rhythm that filled the sudden silence. "You okay there, Bear?" Maggie's voice was gentle. He nodded stiffly, then forced himself to turn toward Eli. "Ready, boy." The clinic's automatic doors whooshed open, releasing a blast of cold air that made Eli shiver. The waiting room smelled of disinfectant and coffee. A few early morning patients looked up briefly from their magazines, then returned to their reading. At the reception desk, Bear spoke in hushed tones with the nurse, while Maggie helped Eli with the paperwork. The boy's feet swung back and forth in the too big chair as he watched Bear. "Just write your name here, honey," Maggie guided Eli's hand. "That's it." Bear paced the waiting room, his heavy boots making soft thuds on the carpet. Each time he passed the window, his shadow fell across Eli, and the boy would look up and smile. Bear tried to smile back, but his face felt stiff, frozen. "Mr. Dalton?" A nurse in blue scrubs appeared. "We're ready for you both." In the small examination room, Bear's large frame made everything seem smaller. He stood in the corner, arms crossed, while the nurse explained the procedure. His eyes never left Eli as the boy bravely offered his arm for the blood draw. "You're doing great, sweetheart," Maggie encouraged, holding Eli's other hand. "Just like a real biker," Bear added gruffly. "Tough as nails." The nurse worked quickly, filling 2 vials, one from Eli, one from Bear. Her movements were efficient and gentle. "All done. You were so brave," she praised Eli, pressing a colorful Band-Aid over the spot. "That's it?" Eli asked, examining the Band-Aid with pride. "That's it," the nurse confirmed. She labeled the vials carefully while explaining to Bear, "The results should be ready in 3 to 4 days. We'll call you." Bear nodded, his face a mask of calm. But Maggie noticed his hands. They trembled slightly as he helped Eli down from the examination table. The same hands that could grip motorcycle handlebars through the worst storms, that could lift engines without effort, now shook with the weight of possibility. "Ice cream time?" Eli asked hopefully, already recovering from the ordeal. "You bet, kid," Bear managed, his voice rough. "You earned it." The nurse watched them go, Bear's large hand resting protectively on Eli's shoulder, Maggie following close behind. "We'll call you with the results," she reminded them. Bear gave one last silent nod as they left, hope and fear waging war in his heart with every step. The morning sun painted the town in golden light as a thundering parade of motorcycles rolled down Main Street. Eli, wearing a miniature leather vest that Maggie had made him, sat proudly in Bear's sidecar. His eyes sparkled with excitement as children waved from the sidewalks. "Ready for your first charity run, kid?" Bear called over the rumble of engines. Eli nodded eagerly, hugging a box of stuffed animals on his lap. The Iron Saints had gathered donations for the children's hospital, and Eli had insisted on helping distribute them. At their first stop, a playground near the hospital, kids gathered around the bikes in wonder. Eli hopped out of the sidecar, his initial shyness melting away as he handed out toys to smiling faces. A little girl with braids hugged her new teddy bear, and Eli's face lit up with pure joy. "Look, Bear," he shouted, pointing at the happy children. They love them! The other bikers watched, in amazement as their youngest member worked his magic. Tough men with graying beards and weathered faces softened at the sight. One of them, Doc, wiped his eyes when he thought no one was looking. Kid's got a heart of gold, Maggie said, having followed in her pickup truck. Just like someone else I know. She nudged Bear with her elbow. Throughout the day, they visited more stops, a shelter, a community center, and finally the children's ward at the hospital. Eli's natural kindness touched everyone he met. The nurses cooed over him, calling him such a sweet boy, while the patients brightened at his cheerful presence. "Hey, little saint," called Snake, one of the younger bikers. "Come show these folks your secret handshake." Eli beamed at his new nickname. He'd spent hours practicing the complicated sequence of fist bumps and high fives with the crew, and now he performed it perfectly, making the sick children laugh. As the afternoon wore on, they stopped at a local park for a cookout. The bikers set up grills and picnic tables, sharing stories and jokes. Eli ran around with some local kids, his laughter carrying across the grass. It was hard to believe this was the same frightened boy who had walked into Maggie's with a gun just days ago. "He's something special," Doc said, flipping burgers. "Ain't seen you smile this much in years, Bear." Bear watched Eli playing tag, his little boots kicking up dust as he ran. "Kid's teaching me more than I'm teaching him," he admitted quietly. As evening settled in, they built a campfire. The flames cast dancing shadows as the bikers gathered around, sharing sodas and roasting marshmallows. Eli sat next to Bear, chocolate smeared on his chin, fighting to keep his eyes open. Stories flowed around the fire, funny road tales, close calls, and memories of brothers lost. Eli listened intently until exhaustion finally won. His head drooped against Bear's leather jacket, and within minutes he was sound asleep. The conversation softened to whispers. Bear adjusted his arm, cradling the boy more comfortably against his side, looking at the peaceful face of the child who had crashed into their lives like a tiny thunderbolt. Bear felt something shift in his heart. "Maybe this is what I was meant for," he whispered to the others, his voice rough with emotion. The fire crackled, sending sparks dancing toward the stars, as the Iron Saints nodded in silent agreement. Their youngest member had changed them all, bringing light to places they thought would stay dark forever. The morning sun beat down on Bear's leather vest as he knelt beside his Harley, polishing the chrome until it sparkled. His worn hands moved in smooth circles, each stroke bringing out a deeper shine. The familiar work usually calmed his mind, but today his thoughts kept drifting to the envelope waiting at the clinic. Eli sat cross-legged nearby, watching with curious eyes as Bear worked. The boy had taken to following him around like a shadow these past few days, soaking up every bit of motorcycle knowledge Bear shared. "Can you teach me how to do that?" Eli asked, pointing at the polishing cloth in Bear's hand. Bear's weathered face softened into a smile. "Sure thing, kid. Come here." The sharp ring of the bar's phone cut through the peaceful morning. Bear's hand froze mid-polish, his heart suddenly thundering in his chest. Through the window, he could see Maggie reaching for the receiver. She poked her head out the door moments later, her expression careful. "Bear? It's the clinic." The polishing cloth slipped from his fingers. Bear stood slowly, his legs feeling like lead as he walked inside. The other bikers who'd been lounging at the bar straightened, watching him with concerned eyes. Maggie held out the phone, giving his arm a gentle squeeze as he took it. The plastic felt cold against his ear. "This is Bear Dalton," he said, his voice rough. The nurse's professional tone carried through the line, explaining medical terms he barely understood. But then came the words that hit him like a physical blow. "The results show no genetic match. Bear's free hand gripped the bar counter, his knuckles turning white. The room seemed to tilt sideways for a moment. "Are you certain?" he managed to ask. "Yes, Mr. Dalton. The test is conclusive." He thanked her mechanically and lowered the phone. The bar had gone completely silent. Maggie stood close, her eyes full of concern. The other bikers leaned forward, waiting. "He's not mine," Bear whispered, the words feeling like gravel in his throat. Through the window, he could see Eli still sitting by the bike, running his small fingers over the polishing cloth Bear had dropped. The sight made his chest ache with a pain deeper than any physical wound he'd ever known. Maggie touched his shoulder. "Bear!" He shook his head, unable to find more words. The hope he'd been nurturing, the dream of making things right, of being the father he should have been, it all crumbled away like dust. One of the older bikers, Doc, cleared his throat. "Blood ain't everything, Bear." But Bear could barely hear him over the roaring in his ears. All he could think about was Annie's letter. The timing that had seemed so perfect, the way Eli's smile reminded him of her. He'd convinced himself it had to be true, that fate had given him a second chance. "I need some air," he mumbled, pushing away from the bar. As he stepped outside, Eli looked up with that same trusting smile he'd worn all week. "Can we finish cleaning the bike now?" Bear stood frozen, the weight of the test results pressing down on his shoulders like a physical burden. The boy who wasn't his son waited expectantly, holding up the polishing cloth like an offering. Behind him, through the window, he could see Maggie watching with tears in her eyes, and his fellow Iron Saints exchanging worried glances. The morning sun still shone just as bright, but somehow everything looked different now, sharper and colder, as if the world itself had shifted on its axis. The silence in Maggie's roadhouse felt heavier than lead. Bear's weathered hands gripped the phone so tight his knuckles turned white. Maggie stood frozen behind the bar, her dish towel forgotten mid-wipe. The other bikers, scattered around their usual spots, didn't dare move. Eli sat at his favorite corner table, working on math homework. Maggie had scrounged up for him. The scratch of his pencil was the only sound breaking the thick quiet. "Something wrong?" Eli's small voice carried across the room. He'd gotten good at reading the mood of the adults around him, like most kids who'd seen too much too young. Bear placed the phone back in its cradle with painful slowness. His boots seemed to drag across the wooden floor as he made his way to Eli's table. Pulling up a chair, he sat down heavily, his leather jacket creaking. "Eli, son." Bear's voice caught in his throat. He'd faced down rival gangs, without flinching, but this moment terrified him more than anything. "We got the test results back from the clinic." Eli's pencil stopped moving. His small fingers tightened around it. "I'm not." Bear swallowed hard. "The test shows I'm not your father." For a moment, Eli just stared at him, uncomprehending. Then his face crumpled like a piece of paper being crushed. "No, you're lying." His voice rose to a shrill cry that made everyone flinch. "Mama promised! She said my daddy would be here!" "I'm so sorry, kid." Bear reached for him, but Eli jerked away, knocking his chair over with a crash. "You're just like everyone else." Tears streamed down his face. "Everyone lies! Everyone leaves!" Before anyone could stop him, Eli bolted from the table. His footsteps thundered up the wooden stairs to Maggie's apartment above the bar. The door slammed so hard the glasses behind the bar rattled. Maggie started to follow, but Bear shook his head. "Let him be, Mags. Boy needs some time." The other bikers drifted away one by one, leaving Bear alone at the bar. Maggie wordlessly set a bottle of whiskey in front of him, but even that couldn't wash away the bitter taste of failure. Hours crawled by. The sky outside turned black as pitch, and rain began to drum against the windows. Bear sat in the darkness, listening to the storm and the occasional muffled sob from upstairs. I should have known better, he muttered into his glass. Should have waited for the results before getting his hopes up, before getting my own hopes up. Maggie touched his shoulder gently. You gave him something he needed, someone who cared enough to try. But Bear barely heard her. His mind was stuck in a loop, remembering how he'd left Annie all those years ago, and now here he was, letting down her boy too. The rain intensified outside, matching his dark mood. Maybe I failed him twice, Bear whispered, his voice barely audible over the storm. First by not being there when Annie needed him, and now by building up hopes he couldn't fulfill. The weight of both failures pressed down on his shoulders like a lead blanket. The lock clicked upstairs, Eli checking if anyone was still awake, but the door remained closed. Bear's hand tightened around his glass, wanting nothing more than to go up there and make things right. But knowing some hurts needed time to heal. The morning light crept through the dusty windows of Maggie's roadhouse, casting long shadows across the wooden floor. Doc sat hunched over a stack of yellowed papers at the corner table, his reading glasses perched on his nose. His weathered hands carefully turned each page, searching for answers. Bear, Doc called out softly, his voice tight with concern. You need to see this. Bear looked up from where he'd been, absently wiping down the bar counter. Dark circles ringed his eyes from a sleepless night. He crossed the room in long strides, his boots heavy against the floorboards. Doc pushed a faded newspaper clipping across the table. Found this in Annie's things. Look at the date. Bear's eyes scanned the article. His jaw clenched. The headline read, Local man sentenced to life for armed robbery. Murder. Ray Monroe, Bear whispered, the name bitter on his tongue. Wildfire. Doc nodded slowly, cross-referenced it with Annie's diary. They were together right before he got locked up. The timing. He trailed off, letting the implication hang in the air. Bear sank into the chair beside Doc, the wood creaking under his weight. Wildfire. That sorry excuse for a saint. His voice was thick with disgust. I remember when we kicked him out. Man was nothing but trouble. There's more. Doc pulled out a small leather-bound book. Annie's diary. She writes about him here. Says he disappeared as soon as she told him she was pregnant. Never even looked back. Bear's fingers traced the edge of the diary, remembering Annie's gentle spirit, how she'd always seen the best in people, even in someone like Wildfire. That monster, Bear growled. He didn't just abandon the club, he abandoned his own blood. Doc removed his glasses, rubbing his tired eyes. Ray's serving life up at State. Murder during a gas station robbery, shot the clerk point blank. The morning quiet was broken only by the distant sound of cars passing on the highway. Bear stood up suddenly, his chair scraping against the floor. His massive frame cast a shadow over the table as he began to pace. All this time, he muttered, that boy's been carrying Wildfire's blood in his veins. He stopped at the window, staring out at nothing in particular. No wonder Annie never told him. How do you tell a child his father's a killer? Doc gathered the papers carefully, sliding them back into their folder. What are we going to tell Eli? Bear's fists clenched at his sides, knuckles white with tension. The muscles in his jaw worked as he struggled to contain his anger. When he finally spoke, his voice was low and dangerous. That boy deserves better than that monster. Bear stood in Maggie's kitchen the next morning, his leather jacket already on. The morning sun cast long shadows through the window as he drained his coffee cup. You don't have to do this, Maggie said, worry lines creasing her forehead. That man's poison. Always was. The other bikers nodded in agreement. Doc spoke up from his corner. Ray Monroe ain't worth the gas money, Bear. He'll just get in your head. Bear set his cup down with a gentle clink. Maybe, but that boy deserves to know the truth. all of it. His voice was quiet but firm. And I need to hear it from Ray himself. The ride to Stillwater State Prison took 3 hours. The autumn wind whipped against Bear's face as his Harley ate up the miles of empty highway. Fields of golden wheat stretched endlessly on either side, giving him too much time to think. He remembered Ray from the old days, young, wild, with a dangerous charm that drew people in. Burned bright and left ashes in his wake. Bear had watched him spiral down into violence and crime, unable to stop his brother's fall. Now, that same man was Eli's father. The thought made Bear's stomach turn. The prison rose up ahead like a gray mountain of concrete and steel. Bear parked his bike and walked through security, his boots echoing off cold walls. The guard led him to a visiting room that smelled of cheap cleaner and stale coffee. Ray Monroe sat waiting, prison jumpsuit hanging loose on his thin frame. His trademark grin hadn't changed, though his face had aged hard behind bars. "Well, well, the mighty Bear Dalton comes to visit little old me." Ray's voice dripped with mock sweetness. "What's the occasion?" Bear sat down slowly, studying the man across the table. "Annie Davidson's boy showed up at Maggie's bar last week. Your boy, Ray." The grin faltered for just a second. Annie? That was ages ago. Ray leaned back, trying to look casual. "What's the kid want?" "His name is Eli," Bear said firmly. "His mother died. He's looking for his father." Ray barked out a harsh laugh. "And you rode all this way to tell me? Sorry to disappoint, but I'm not exactly father material." He gestured at his surroundings. "Kind of occupied at the moment. He's 8 years old, Ray. Smart, brave." Bear's voice grew quiet. "He deserves to know where he comes from. Listen up, old man." Ray's face hardened. "That kid's nothing to me. Just a mistake from a drunk weekend with some waitress. You want to play daddy? Be my guest, but leave me out of it." Bear's hands tightened into fists under the table, but his voice stayed steady. "You haven't changed a bit, Ray. Still running from anything that matters." "Save the sermon." Ray stood up abruptly. "We're done here. Guard!" Bear watched as Ray shuffled toward the door, chains jingling. At the last moment, Ray turned back with that old snake smile. "Hey, Bear, tell the kid his real daddy says hi." Bear didn't respond. He waited until Ray was gone, then walked out of the prison in silence. The autumn sun felt colder now. His eyes were hard with purpose as he mounted his bike, the engine's rumble matching the determination in his heart. The rain hammered down like bullets on Bear's leather jacket as he guided his Harley through the pitch-black night. Each mile marker that flashed past in his headlights brought him closer to home, to Eli. But the conversation with Ray, wildfire. Monroe kept replaying in his mind like a broken record. "That kid?" Ray had sneered through the prison glass. "Ain't nothing to me but a mistake. Tell him to forget my name." Thunder cracked overhead, matching the storm brewing inside Bear's chest. The highway stretched empty before him, a ribbon of wet asphalt disappearing into darkness. His hands, cold and stiff on the handlebars, reminded him of another rainy night decades ago when he'd left Annie behind. 2 times he'd failed to be there when someone needed him. The bike's engine growled as he pulled into a small gas station, its fluorescent lights creating a harsh bubble in the darkness. Bear's joints creaked as he dismounted, his clothes heavy with rain. Inside, he caught his reflection in the grimy bathroom mirror. An old biker with silver hair plastered to his head, lines etched deep around his eyes, looking every bit his 60-plus years. "Not blood, but heart," he muttered to his reflection, remembering how Eli's small hand had felt in his when they walked together. The boy's smile when Bear taught him to balance on the parked motorcycle. The trust in those young eyes, The cashier eyed him warily as he paid for his coffee, probably seeing just another rough-looking biker. But Bear barely noticed. His mind was full of Eli. The way the kid helped Maggie with the dishes without being asked, how he'd light up when the other bikers called him Little Saint. The quiet strength he showed despite everything life had thrown at him. Back on the road, memories washed over Bear like the endless rain. He remembered his own father, a man who'd been present in body but absent in spirit. The childhood lessons of what not to do as a parent, then his time in the service, where he'd learned that family wasn't about blood, it was about who stood beside you when the world turned dark. The storm began to ease as he crossed county lines. Through breaks in the clouds, the first hints of dawn painted the sky in shades of purple and gold. Bear's clothes were soaked through, his bones ached, but his mind was clearer than it had been in years. He thought about Ray sitting in that prison cell, throwing away the chance to know his own son. The man had everything Bear wanted, and didn't deserve an ounce of it. But maybe that was the point. Being a father wasn't about deserving, or blood, or DNA tests. It was about choosing to love, to protect, to be there every single day. The familiar shape of Maggie's roadhouse emerged from the morning mist as Bear turned off the highway. The gravel crunched under his tires as he pulled into the empty parking lot, cutting the engine. He sat there for a moment, water dripping from his beard, exhausted but somehow lighter than he'd felt in days. A light was on in the bar's back room. Maggie would be starting her morning routine, and somewhere inside, Eli would be sleeping. Bear climbed off his bike, his boots squishing with each step toward the door. He'd made his choice. DNA didn't make a father. Love did. And he had more than enough of that to give. The morning drizzle painted everything in shades of gray. Eli sat hunched on the worn wooden steps of Maggie's roadhouse, his small backpack pressed against his chest like a shield. His sneakers were already soaked, and his hair stuck to his forehead, but he didn't seem to care. The child's eyes, red from crying, stared at the puddles forming in the gravel parking lot. Inside the bar, faces pressed against the windows. Maggie wrung her, hands in worry, while the other bikers shifted restlessly, wanting to help but knowing this moment wasn't theirs. Bear's motorcycle rumbled into the lot, cutting through the patter of rain. He killed the engine but stayed seated for a moment, taking in the sight of the boy who'd changed everything. His leather jacket dripped as he finally dismounted, each step toward Eli careful and measured. "Going somewhere, kid?" Bear's voice was gentle, barely louder than the rain. Eli hugged his backpack tighter. "You're not my dad," he whispered, his voice cracking. "And my real dad doesn't want me. Nobody wants me." Bear moved closer, his boots scraping against the wet gravel. "That's not true, son. Don't call me that!" Eli shouted, jumping to his feet. His backpack tumbled down the steps, spilling its meager contents. A few clothes, a candy bar, and the photo of his mother. "I'm not your son. I'm nobody's son." The rain fell harder now. But Bear didn't flinch. He knelt in the mud, getting eye level with the boy. Water streamed down his weathered face, mixing with what might have been tears. "Listen to me, Eli," Bear said, his voice thick with emotion. "I just rode 60 miles to meet your birth father. Want to know what I learned?" Eli sniffled, nodding slightly. "I learned that being a father isn't about whose blood you share. It's about who stays, who cares, who loves you enough to get up every morning and try their best to give you a good life." "But," Eli's lower lip trembled, "but everyone leaves. Mom left. My real dad left. You'll leave too." Bear shook his head slowly, rain dripping from his beard. "You don't need a man who made you, Eli. You need one who won't leave you." He opened his arms. "And I'm not going anywhere." Eli stood frozen, tears streaming down his face. "Promise? Cross my heart," Bear said solemnly. "You belong here, son. With me, with Maggie, with all these knuckleheads watching us through the window." He gestured toward the bar, where several bikers quickly pretended they hadn't been staring. A sob escaped Eli's throat. He launched himself into Bear's arms, nearly knocking the big man backward. Bear caught him, holding him tight as the boy cried into his shoulder. "I was so scared," Eli hiccuped between sobs. "Me too, kid," Bear admitted, his voice rough with emotion. "Me too." Through the rain, they could hear sniffling from the doorway. The other bikers had come outside, standing in a protective semicircle around Bear and Eli. Doc was wiping his eyes with a bandana, while Maggie didn't even try to hide her tears. Bear stood slowly, still holding Eli. The boy's arms were locked around his neck, and neither seemed willing to let go. The rain continued to fall, but something had changed in its rhythm. It no longer felt cold and lonely, but cleansing, healing. The morning sun pierced through dark clouds, casting golden rays across Maggie's roadhouse. Inside, the familiar scent of bacon and coffee filled the air, as Maggie worked her magic at the grill. The sizzle of breakfast cooking mixed with quiet conversation and the occasional laugh from the bikers scattered around the bar's worn tables. Bear sat at the counter, a stack of papers spread before him, his reading glasses perched on his nose as he carefully went through each document. Adoption papers. Words like permanent guardian and parental rights jumped out at him. His weathered hands, more used to gripping handlebars than pens, moved steadily across each page. "Need more coffee?" Maggie asked, already pouring him a fresh cup. Her eyes were warm with approval as she glanced at the papers. "Thanks, Mags." Bear's voice was rough with emotion. "Never thought I'd be filling out paperwork like this." Eli bounded down the stairs from the apartment above the bar, his face bright with excitement. "Is that breakfast I smell?" He slid onto the stool next to Bear, trying to peek at the papers. "Sure is, sweetheart," Maggie said, sliding a plate, piled high with pancakes in front of him. "Eat up while it's hot." The other Iron Saints started filtering in, filling the bar with their usual morning chatter. Doc, the club's treasurer, carried a large coffee can filled with cash, proceeds from their latest fundraiser for local kids. "Look at this, Bear," Doc said, dumping the money onto a cleared table. "Enough here to start that summer program for foster kids we talked about." Bear nodded, watching Eli devour his breakfast. The boy had changed them all, awakened something in the club that had been dormant for too long. What started as a search for one boy's father had grown into a mission to help all the lost children they could find. "Hey, Dad," Eli said between bites, the word still new but feeling more natural each time. "Can I help count the money?" Bear's heart swelled at being called Dad. He'd never thought such a simple word could mean so much. "Sure thing, kid. Just wash those sticky hands first." The morning passed in a blur of paperwork and planning. The bikers huddled around maps, plotting charity rides and discussing which families needed help next. Maggie kept the coffee flowing, occasionally squeezing Bear's shoulder in silent support. By late afternoon, Bear's signature graced the final page. He sat back, exhaling slowly, feeling the weight of responsibility settle more firmly on his shoulders. It felt right. "All done?" Eli asked, looking up from where he was helping Doc organize bills into neat stacks. "All done," Bear confirmed. "Just need to file these with the court tomorrow." The boy's eyes lit up. "Then it's official? You're really my dad?" "On paper and in my heart, son." Bear pulled him into a tight hug, not caring who saw the tears in his eyes. "Always will be." As evening approached, the bar filled with celebration. Someone ordered pizza, and the jukebox played softly in the background. The Iron Saints raised their glasses, soda for Eli, in a build, toast to family found rather than born. Later, Bear led a sleepy Eli up to bed in what was now their apartment above the bar. The room, once Maggie's storage space, had been transformed with help from the club. Model motorcycles lined shelves alongside books and toys. A handmade quilt, stitched by some of the bikers' wives, covered the bed. Eli crawled under the covers, yawning. Bear sat on the edge of the bed, his large frame gentle as he tucked the blanket around his son's shoulders. "You're home now, son," he whispered, watching Eli's eyes drift closed. The morning sun painted Maggie's roadhouse parking lot in golden light. Dozens of motorcycles gleamed in neat rows, their chrome surfaces catching the early rays. The Iron Saints had gathered for their first charity ride since Eli came into their lives, and the excitement buzzed through the air like electricity. Bear stood at the center of the group, his weathered hands resting on Eli's shoulders. The boy couldn't stop fidgeting, his eyes wide as he watched the bikers prepare for the ride. Some were attaching teddy bears to their handlebars, while others secured boxes of donated toys to their sidecars. "Got a surprise for you, kiddo," Bear said, his voice gruff with emotion. He nodded to Doc, who stepped forward holding something behind his back. Eli bounced on his toes. "What is it?" Doc pulled out a small leather vest, perfectly sized for an 8-year-old. The leather was soft and new, nothing like the worn jackets the older men wore. But what caught everyone's attention was the patch sewn carefully onto the back. A small, gleaming emblem that read, "Prospect of Hope," beneath the Iron Saints logo. The boy's mouth fell open. His fingers trembled as he reached for the vest. "Try it on, son," Bear encouraged, helping Eli slip his arms through the leather. The vest fit perfectly, like it was made just for him. Maggie appeared in the doorway of the bar, wiping her hands on her apron. Her eyes glistened as she watched the scene unfold. "Looking sharp, little saint," called out one of the bikers. Others joined in with whoops and hollers, their rough voices carrying across the lot. Eli spun in a circle, trying to see the patch on his own back. His face glowed with joy, and for a moment Bear saw no trace of the scared, angry boy who had burst into the bar with a gun. This was a child who had found his family. "What do you think?" Bear asked, kneeling down to adjust the collar. Eli threw his arms around Bear's neck. "I love it, Dad." The word hung in the air for a moment. It wasn't the first time Eli had called him Dad, but never so publicly, never with such certainty. The bikers fell silent, watching the moment unfold. Bear's throat tightened. He pulled back slightly, looking into Eli's eyes, eyes that held trust instead of fear now. A single tear rolled down his weathered cheek, catching in his beard. "All right, Iron Saints," Bear called out, his voice rough with emotion. "Let's ride." Bikers moved to their machines, leather creaking and boots scraping on asphalt. Engines roared to life, one by one, a symphony of thunder that echoed off the bar's walls. Bear helped Eli into the new sidecar they'd attached to his bike, making sure the boy's helmet was secure. Maggie stepped forward, handing Eli a small bag of snacks for the ride. "You take care of your dad out there," she said with a wink. Bear swung his leg over his motorcycle, feeling its familiar rumble beneath him. He looked down at Eli, snug in the sidecar, wearing his new vest proudly. The morning sun caught the Prospect of Hope patch, making it shine like a beacon. As the engines thundered around them, Bear reached down and squeezed Eli's shoulder. Another tear escaped, but this time he didn't try to hide it. The roar of motorcycles filled the air, drowning out everything except the joy in their hearts. The evening sun painted long shadows across Maggie's roadhouse as the bikers began heading home. The Day's charity ride had left everyone's spirits high, especially Eli's, who kept touching his new patch with pride. While the boy played cards with some remaining Iron Saints, Maggie disappeared into the back storage room, searching for extra paper napkins. In the dim light, she stumbled upon a dusty cardboard box labeled Lost and Found. 2,000. Her hands trembled as she recognized an old brown leather purse inside. The worn bag still held Annie Monroe's distinct grace. Simple, elegant, like the woman herself. "Oh, Annie," Maggie whispered, running her fingers over the scratched surface. She remembered the young woman who used to sit at the end of the bar, writing in her journal and waiting for a certain biker to return. Inside the purse, among old receipts and a faded lipstick, Maggie found an envelope. The paper had yellowed with age, but the seal remained unbroken. In neat handwriting, it was addressed simply to H.D. Henry Bear Dalton. Maggie's heart skipped a beat. She clutched the letter to her chest and hurried back to the main room. "Bear," she called softly, finding him wiping down tables. "I need to show you something." Bear looked up, his weathered face still glowing from the day's events. When he saw the purse in Maggie's hands, his expression shifted. "That's Annie's," Maggie finished. "Found it in storage. But this," she held out the envelope, "this is for you." Bear's hands shook as he took the letter. He glanced at Eli, still absorbed in his card game, then walked to a quiet corner of the bar. The paper crackled as he carefully broke the seal. Maggie watched as Bear's eyes moved across the page, his breathing growing uneven. She could see Annie's delicate handwriting through the thin paper. "Dear Henry, if you're reading this, it means our boy has found his way to you. I always knew he would. Life has its own way of bringing people together, even when they think they're lost to each other forever. I want you to know I never blamed you for leaving. War changes people, and sometimes the road back home seems too long to travel. But I've watched you from afar through the years, seen how you've led the Iron Saints with honor and compassion. If Bear Dalton ever finds my boy, let him. He's the only man I trust to love him like I do. You may not be his father by blood, but you have the heart I always knew could guide him. Take care of our Eli. Show him that family isn't just about whose blood runs in your veins, it's about who stays when the storms come. With eternal faith in your goodness." Annie Bear's legs gave out, and he sank into a nearby chair. Tears rolled freely down his cheeks as he pressed the letter to his heart. "You knew," he whispered, his voice rough with emotion. "Annie, you knew. You always knew." Maggie laid a gentle hand on his shoulder, her own eyes misty. Through the blur of tears, Bear watched Eli laugh at something one of the bikers said. The boy's smile was pure sunshine, just like his mother's had been. The letter trembled in Bear's hands as Annie's final gift washed over him. Forgiveness, understanding, and the blessing he never knew he needed. She had trusted him with her greatest treasure, knowing that one day love would find its way home. The morning sun painted Maggie's roadhouse in warm golden light as Bear and a group of bikers moved tables around inside. The familiar scent of coffee and bacon mixed with fresh paint and sawdust. They'd spent the past few weeks transforming the bar's unused back room into something special. "A little more to the left," Maggie called out, directing two burly bikers carrying a donated desk. Her eyes sparkled with purpose as she surveyed the space. What was once a dusty storage room now held promise and possibility. Eli darted between the workers, carrying a box of office supplies almost as big as he was. "Where should I put these, Dad?" Bear's heart swelled at the word. It still felt new, like a gift he'd never tire of receiving. "Over by the filing cabinet, son." And careful with those scissors. The walls, freshly painted in warm cream, displayed framed photos of their charity rides and community events. A large cork board waited to be filled with upcoming projects and volunteer sign-up sheets. In the corner, a play area took shape, with colorful beanbags and shelves of children's books. "Who would have thought," Maggie mused, standing beside Bear, "that one scared little boy with a rusty gun would change everything?" Bear watched as Eli helped Doc organize donation boxes. "The Lord works in mysterious ways, I suppose." The Little Saints Foundation was Bear's way of turning pain into purpose. They'd help kids who lost parents, support struggling single mothers, and give veterans a place to belong. The idea had come to him one night while watching Eli sleep. How many other children needed someone to step up and be there for them? The bikers had embraced the change wholeheartedly. Tough men who once lived only for the road now spent weekends fixing broken playground equipment and teaching kids to ride bikes. Their leather vests now sported patches reading Community Guardian alongside their Iron Saints colors. "Hey, Dad," Eli called out, waving from across the room. "Can we paint the sign now?" Bear nodded, grabbing the paint supplies they'd prepared. Outside, a large wooden sign lay propped against sawhorses, waiting for its final touch. The spring breeze carried the sweet scent of nearby flowering trees. "Ready for this, little saint?" Bear handed Eli a small brush. Together, they began painting the letters, "The Little Saints Foundation, where lost souls find family." Eli's tongue stuck out in concentration as he carefully filled in each letter. Paint somehow found its way onto his nose and cheeks, making Bear chuckle. "You're supposed to get it on the sign, son, not your face." "Look who's talking," Eli giggled, pointing at the blue smudge on Bear's forehead. Their laughter drew others outside. Soon, several bikers joined in, adding decorative touches to the sign's border. Maggie brought out lemonade and cookies, watching the scene with maternal pride. "Need some help there, Papa Bear?" Doc teased, reaching for a brush. "The more the merrier," Bear replied, ruffling Eli's hair. "This is about family, after all." They worked together under the warming sun, their joy infectious. Eli's giggles mixed with the bikers' deep laughter, creating a melody of happiness that echoed across the parking lot. Paint dripped and splattered, but nobody minded. This wasn't just about making a sign. It was about marking a new beginning, a testament to how love could transform lives. The morning sun painted golden streaks across the empty school parking lot as Bear's motorcycle rumbled to a stop. Eli sat behind him, arms wrapped tight around Bear's waist, his brand-new backpack decorated with motorcycle patches that Maggie had sewn on herself. "You ready, kiddo?" Bear asked, his gruff voice gentle as he helped Eli off the bike. Eli's fingers fidgeted with the straps of his backpack. "What if they don't like me?" he whispered, his eyes fixed on his scuffed sneakers. Bear knelt down, his leather jacket creaking. He adjusted Eli's collar with weathered hands that had grown surprisingly tender over the past months. "Hey now, look at me." He waited until Eli's eyes met his. "Remember what we talked about? Be brave, be kind, be myself." Eli recited, managing a small smile. "That's right." Bear ruffled his hair. "And remember, you've got the whole Iron Saints backing you up." Other parents began arriving with their children. Not too long ago, they might have hurried past a leather-clad biker, pulling their kids close. But now, several waved warmly. "Morning, Bear," called Mrs. Thompson, the grocery store owner. "Is this Eli's first day?" "Sure is," Bear replied, standing tall with pride. "Welcome to Lincoln Elementary, sweetheart," she said to Eli. "My, Tommy's in 3rd grade, too. Maybe you'll be in the same class." More families arrived, and to Bear's amazement, Many stopped to chat. Word had spread about the Little Saints Foundation and the work they'd been doing. The feared biker gang had transformed into community heroes, all because of one brave little boy with a rusty revolver and a desperate heart. Maggie pulled up in her old pickup truck, carrying a box of homemade cookies for the teacher's lounge. She watched the scene unfold with misty eyes, remembering that stormy night that had changed everything. The bar owner, who'd lost her own son years ago now, had a whole extended family of rough-looking angels, and one special little boy who'd brought healing to them all. "Look at this," she said softly, joining Bear. "Who'd have thought?" "Not me," Bear admitted, watching Eli slowly relax as Tommy Thompson showed him his collection of motorcycle trading cards. "Never thought I'd be anybody's father, let alone." "The best kind," Maggie finished for him. "The kind that chooses it." The first bell rang, and kids began streaming toward the building. Eli ran back for one more quick hug, nearly knocking Bear over. "Love you, Dad," he said, the words still new but feeling more natural every day. "Love you too, son." Bear's voice cracked slightly. "Make us proud." Eli joined the crowd of students, his Iron Saints patch catching the morning light. He turned back once to wave, then disappeared through the front doors with his new friend Tommy. Bear stood there, his imposing figure softened by emotion, watching until the last student entered the building. "That's my boy," he whispered, his heart fuller than he'd ever thought possible. A warm breeze stirred the American flag above the school, carrying with it the echo of children's laughter. Bear felt Maggie's hand on his arm, offering silent support. They both knew that sometimes the best families aren't born, they're built, one act of love at a time. Autumn leaves danced through the air as the town square buzzed with activity. Colorful booths lined the cobblestone streets, and the smell of caramel apples and cotton candy filled the crisp afternoon air. The Iron Saints booth stood out with its black and silver banner, proudly displaying "The Little Saints Foundation" in bold letters. Bear watched from behind their table as Eli arranged handmade friendship bracelets in neat rows. Each one was unique, woven with care by the bikers during their evening gatherings at Maggie's. Some had hope threaded into their patterns, others showed tiny motorcycle designs. "How's the setup coming along, son?" Bear asked, adjusting his leather vest. Eli beamed up at him. "Perfect. Doc taught me to organize them by color, see?" He pointed to the rainbow arrangement before him. The other bikers had spread out through the festival, their leather vests now sporting patches that read "Community Service Team." A small crowd gathered as Eli enthusiastically explained the Foundation's mission to anyone who stopped by. His natural charm drew people in, making even the most hesitant visitors smile. Maggie, manning the hot chocolate station next door, couldn't help but grin every time she heard his earnest sales pitch. "Every bracelet helps another kid like me find their family," Eli would say, his eyes bright with purpose. As the afternoon wore on, Bear noticed a boy about Eli's age hovering near their booth. The child kept his distance, hands in his pockets, watching the festival-goers with lonely eyes. He wore a worn jacket that seemed too thin for the autumn chill. Eli noticed, too. Without hesitation, he grabbed one of the special bracelets, one he'd made himself, and walked over to the boy. "Hi, I'm Eli," he said, holding out the bracelet. "Want to be friends?" The boy stared at the offered gift, uncertain. I don't have any money. It's not for sale." Eli smiled. "It's a welcome gift. You've got family now, too." He gestured toward the booth where Bear and several other Iron Saints stood watching. "See those guys? They look scary, but they're really just big teddy bears, especially that one. He's my dad." Bear's heart swelled as he watched the interaction. The lonely boy's face lit up as Eli helped him tie the bracelet around his wrist. Soon, both boys were laughing, sharing stories over Maggie's hot chocolate. As dusk settled over the festival, lanterns twinkled to life throughout the square. The first firework burst overhead, painting the sky in brilliant colors. Bear pulled Eli close, noticing how his son's eyes reflected the sparkling display. "Your mom would have been proud," Bear said softly, his voice thick with emotion. The festival continued around them, but for that moment, time seemed to stand still as father and son watched the sky light up, their hearts full of gratitude for the family they'd found in each other. The autumn morning dawned crisp and clear as Bear stood in front of Maggie's roadhouse, checking his motorcycle one last time. Today's charity ride wasn't just any event. It was special, dedicated to Annie's memory. His weathered hands traced the new decal on his bike, "Annie's Angels, Riding for Hope." Maggie emerged from the bar, carrying a box of purple ribbons, Annie's favorite color. She wore a denim jacket with a fresh Iron Saints patch, marking her as their official road mother. Her eyes glistened as she handed out the ribbons to the gathering crowd. "She would have loved this," Maggie said softly, pinning a ribbon to Bear's leather vest. Annie always believed in helping others. Eli bounded down the bar steps, his small boots clicking against the wooden boards. His own vest was decorated with patches earned over the past months, each one representing a different charitable deed. He carried a framed photo of his mother, which would ride in Maggie's truck at the head of the parade. "Ready, Dad?" Eli asked, bouncing on his toes with excitement. Bear's heart swelled at the word Dad. It still felt like a gift every time he heard it. "Ready as I'll ever be, son." The rumble of engines filled the air as dozens of bikes lined up behind Bear's. The Iron Saints had spread the word, and clubs from 3 states had shown up to support the cause. Even some of the town's most proper citizens had traded their Sunday best for leather and denim. Maggie climbed into her decorated pickup truck, banners fluttering from the sides. "The Little Saints Foundation, where lost souls find family." The bed was filled with care packages they'd distribute along the route: food, clothing, and toys for families in need. As Bear kicked his bike to life, Eli settled into the custom sidecar they'd built together. The boy pulled on his goggles, still slightly too big for his face, and gave a thumbs up. The sight made several tough bikers grin and shake their heads. They rode through Main Street first, where shopkeepers and families lined the sidewalks. Children waved flags and cheered as the parade of bikes thundered past. The local paper's photographer snapped pictures, capturing the moment when the town's perception of the Iron Saints had shifted from fear to respect. The route took them through golden wheat fields, where the morning sun painted everything in honey-warm light. Bear felt something loosen in his chest. A knot of guilt and regret he'd carried for decades, slowly unwinding. Each mile brought peace, each turn revealed beauty he'd forgotten how to see. At one stop, an elderly woman approached Bear with tears in her eyes. "Annie used to bring me soup when I was sick," she said, pressing a donation into his hands. "She'd be so proud of what you're doing." The convoy wound through 3 small towns, leaving hope and help in their wake. By late afternoon, they'd distributed every care package and raised more money than they'd dreamed possible. Maggie's truck bed was now filled with thank you cards and flowers from grateful recipients. As the sun began its descent, painting the sky in brilliant oranges and pinks, the group returned to Maggie's roadhouse. Bear parked his bike in front, the metal still warm from the long ride. Eli climbed off the sidecar and straight into Bear's lap on the motorcycle. "We're home, aren't we?" Eli whispered, leaning back against his father's chest. Bear wrapped his arms around his son, taking in the moment, the sunset, the peaceful expression on Eli's face, the sound of friendly chatter as riders dismounted around them. His voice was rough with emotion as he answered, "We sure are, son." The The setting sun painted Maggie's roadhouse in shades of amber and gold. Fresh paint gleamed on the weathered boards, transforming the old bar into something new and hopeful. Above the entrance, the new sign caught the fading light. Home of the Iron Saints, where lost souls find family. Paper lanterns, strung between posts, swayed gently in the evening breeze. Bikes lined the parking lot in neat rows, their chrome reflecting the warm glow. The whole town had turned out, families with children, elderly couples in lawn chairs, teenagers perched on truck beds. The crowd hummed with excitement and anticipation. Bear stood on the wooden platform they'd built for the occasion, his massive frame casting a long shadow. For once, his leather vest was clean and pressed. Eli stood beside him, small fingers wrapped tightly around Bear's calloused hand. The boy wore his "Prospect of Hope" patch proudly on his own tiny vest. "Folks," Bear began, his deep voice carrying across the hushed crowd, "never thought I'd see the day when this many people would show up to hear a biker talk." Gentle laughter rippled through the gathering. He cleared his throat, emotion making his voice rough. "The Little Saints Foundation ain't just about helping orphans and veterans, it's about second chances, about finding family in places you least expect it." He squeezed Eli's hand. "Sometimes the greatest gifts come wrapped in our deepest hurts." Maggie wiped tears from her eyes as she stood near the front, remembering that stormy night when a scared little boy changed everything. "Annie Monroe knew something I didn't," Bear continued, his eyes growing misty. "She knew that family ain't about blood, it's about love. About choosing to stay when staying gets hard." He looked down at Eli, who beamed up at him. "This foundation is her legacy, a place where lost souls can find their way home." The Iron Saints lined up their bikes, engines rumbling low like distant thunder. Doc handed out paper lanterns to the crowd, each one carrying a small flame of hope. "To new beginnings," Bear said, lifting his lantern first. One by one, the floating lights rose into the darkening sky, carrying wishes and prayers on the evening breeze. The sight brought fresh tears to many eyes, tough bikers included. Eli tugged on Bear's vest. "Look, Dad, they're like stars!" Bear lifted his son onto his shoulders, both of them watching the lanterns drift higher. The crowd broke into spontaneous applause as the Iron Saints revved their engines in salute, the roar echoing across the parking lot and into the hills beyond. In that moment, as the lanterns floated like earthbound stars and the engines sang their thunderous song, Bear felt a presence, warm and familiar. He could almost hear Annie's laugh on the wind, see her smile in the glow of the setting sun. "Thank you, Annie," he whispered, his words carried away by the evening breeze. The story of the boy with the gun had become a story of grace, second chances, and the kind of love that builds bridges across the deepest chasms. As the bikes roared to life, father and son ready to lead the victory ride, the horizon stretched before them, painted in endless shades of hope.